Alright, so like I told you before, you're doing a factoring and quadratic formula review today. This is all material you've done before in Algebra 1, but we just need to go over it because we will be using it in the next section coming up. So, we know a quadratic formula usually looks like ax squared plus bx plus c, right, where a, b, and c might be some numbers. So if I were to take, let's ignore that for a second, but if I were to have down here, we know factored form, once we get it in factored form, it would usually look something like this. A plus x, or I'm sorry, x plus a times x plus b. So if I were to FOIL those out, multiply them out, and figure out what that is, I have x times x is x squared, x times b is bx, a times x, which is ax, and then a times b, which is ab. Well, here I have bx and ax, so I can combine those two terms to get that x squared plus a plus b times x plus ab. You don't have to memorize this, but we see that I have that x squared all by itself. Here I have that those two factors, or those two terms that I end up with, I add them together to get that middle term that's connected to x, and then I multiply them to get that last term. So that's what we're trying to find today. We're trying to find two numbers that multiply to give me c and add to give me b that's connected to x. So you should all have your lesson for this that looks like this. I'm just going to go through and do a couple with you, and then that's it for today. So we're just going to do a couple together. Whatever you don't finish is homework. You have to do both the front and back. This front side is all on factoring. The back side is all on the quadratic formula. So if I just start with this first one, x squared plus 5x minus 14 equals 0. We always have to have that they equal 0. So make sure if it doesn't look like that, you somehow change it, add or subtracting to get it to look like it equals 0. So now that I have that, I'm going to put my parentheses. One set of parentheses times the other set of parentheses equals 0. And I know that since I have x squared, I'm going to multiply two x's in order to get there. So that takes care of that first term, x squared. Now looking at the last term, negative 14. Well, looking at 14, what numbers can I multiply to get 14? I can multiply 1 and 14 and 7 and 2. So now I need to see, do 1 and 14 or 7 and 2 somehow added together give me plus 5. Well, since I have negative 14 here, I have to have negative 7 and positive 2, or positive 7 and negative 2, or same thing with 14 and 1. One has to be positive, the other one has to be negative. So if I do 1 and 14, when I add those together, I get 15. When I subtract them, I get 13. So that does not give me 5. So 14 and 1 will not work. So I know I have to use 7 and 2. Now I just have to figure out, well, those multiply to give me 14, 14, and I have to somehow get them to add to be positive 5. Well, like I said, one of them has to be positive, the other one has to be negative. Well, since they have to add to be 5, the larger one has to be positive, and the smaller number has to be negative. Now you can go back and check. X times x is x squared. X times 7 is 7x. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. So now I have 7x minus 2x gives me 5x. And then negative 2 times 7, which gives you negative 14. So that gets us back to where we started, so we know we did this correctly. And now that I have x minus 2 times x plus 7 equals 0, I can set each of these terms, or each of these parts, equal to 0 to find what x is. So I can say x minus 2 equals 0, and x plus 7 equals 0. Now I just solve. Add 2 to both sides, x equals 2, and subtract 7 from both sides, x equals negative 7. And so those are my two answers. So there's one like that. Let's also do E. So x squared plus 3x minus 31 equals negative 3. So remember, we have to have both sides to have, I'm not so sorry, not both sides. We have to have one side equal to 0. So I have to get rid of this 3 here, so I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I have x squared plus 3x minus 28 equals 0. Well, in order to, I need to get something that multiplies to equal 28 and adds to equal 3. So the numbers that multiply to give me 28 are 1 and 28, 2 and 14, 4 and 7. Well, I have negative 28. I need one of them to be positive, one of them to be negative, and I have to get them to add to equal 3. 1 and 28 and 2 and 14 are a little too high in order for me to get them to equal positive 3. So that means I must have 7 and 4. Remember, I have x and x because they're going to multiply to give me x squared. And then I have 4 and 7 because that multiplies to give me negative 28. Remember, one has to be negative, one has to be positive, because a negative times a positive gives me a negative. But they have to add to equal 3. If I made 4 positive and 7 negative, when I add them together, I get negative 3. And that's not the same thing as positive 3. So my larger number has to be positive, and my smaller number has to be negative. Now, x minus 4 equals 0, and x plus 7 equals 0. And then I solve for x. I add 4 to both sides to get that x equals 4, and I subtract 7 from both sides to get that x equals negative 7. So there's a couple examples for you there. I want to move down and do some of the ones where our leading coefficient is not 1. Again, this should be all review for you from Algebra 1, but let's look at part G. So I have 2x plus 19x equals negative 24. Remember, we must have them equal 0. So I'm going to add 24 to both sides. So 2x squared plus 19x plus 24 equals 0. Well, since I have 2x at the beginning, or I'm sorry, 2x squared at the beginning, and not just x squared, I need to set up my parentheses. And I can't have x and x as the first term in each one. I have to have 2x in one of them and x in the other. Now I need to look at what multiplies to give me 24. I could use 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 16. So you just have to play around with your numbers and figure out which one of those multiplies to give you 24. But also when you plug it back in and distribute and FOIL, you get that adds to 19. In this case, I have positive 24, so both of my numbers are going to be positive, and those numbers are going to be 8 and 3. I know that they both have to be positive because we're adding to 19. I couldn't have, if this number was positive, 24 was positive and 19 was negative, I could have both of them be negative, because a negative times a negative will still give me positive 24, but when I add them together, I would get a negative 19. But in this case, they both have to be positive. So 2x plus 3 and x plus 8, and I set each one of those equal to 0. So 2x plus 3 equals 0, x plus 8 equals 0, and I subtract 3 from both sides, so 2x equals negative 3, and divide by 2, x equals negative 3 over 2. So there's one of them, and then here I just subtract 8 to get that x equals negative 8. Okay, let's do one more. I'm going to do k. So, again, now I have 2x squared. I need to somehow get, well, it's equal to 0, so I don't have to do anything there, but I need to get 2x and x out in front. Those numbers have to multiply to give me 35. The only way I can multiply to get 35 are 35 and 1 or 7 and 5. So I'm going to use 7 and 5. The position that they're in, whether it's 7 here and 5 here or the other way around, that's going to matter because we have that 2x there. So in this case, I'm going to put 7 here and 5 here. And they have to multiply to be negative 35. So I need one of them to be positive, one of them to be negative. And in this case, I want 7 to be negative and 5 to be positive. So now I can take each of those and set them equal to 0. So 2x plus 5 equals 0, and x minus 7 equals 0. So 2x equals negative 5. And divide by 2, x equals negative 5 over 2. and I add 7 to both sides, so x equals 7. So there's a couple examples. You need to finish the front on your own. I want to move to the back and just do one example with you. On the back, we are doing some examples with quadratic formula. So remember, this formula at the top is not correct. It is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So make sure you put that negative in there to show it's negative b. And now we're just going to use the quadratic formula. I'm going to do the first one with you. Remember that a is that number that goes with x squared. In this case, I just have a negative, so that a is negative 1, because remember there's an invisible 1 there. B is the coefficient with x, and so that is just 1 in this case, again, because there's an invisible 1. And then c is 2. So I'm just going to use that formula. X equals negative b, well, b is 1, so negative 1 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's 1 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 1, times c, which is 2. And then that whole thing over 2a. Well, a is negative 1. So let's just simplify that all together. So I have x equals negative 1 plus or minus square root. 1 squared is 1. I have minus times minus, so plus. 4 times 1 times 2 is 8 over negative 2. And so now I know that this 1 plus 8 is 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. So x equals negative 1 plus or minus 3 over negative 2. And that plus or minus means I need to do these two different ways. I'm going to do it the first way adding, the second way subtracting to give me two different answers. So the first one I'm going to add. Negative 1 plus 3 is 2. Divided by negative 2. 2 divided by negative 2 is negative 1. So there's one answer for me. And now I have to do the other one but subtracting. So negative 1 minus 3 is negative 4. Over negative 2. Negative 4 divided by negative 2 is 2. So my two answers for this problem are negative 1 and 2. So make sure you finish up the rest of this worksheet today in class. You need to do the exit ticket for both Monday, or if you're an A day, or Wednesday if you're B day, and then I need you to do the exit ticket for today also once you finish with this worksheet. And then turn it in, and you do not have any homework over the weekend. I should be seeing you guys on Monday and Tuesday when we're going to move on, and you will need factoring in order to move on with the next section. So make sure you're feeling comfortable with this. Go back and review whatever you need to, but all of you should know this from Algebra 1.